It was supposed to be just another night in Darlow, Missouri, the kind of town where nothing happened, where the streets after dark were so quiet you could hear a dog bark from 3 blocks away. A sleepy town insulated by routine. But on October 7, 1981, inside a small Gulf gas station on Route 6, 3 young men reported for the overnight shift, and before dawn, they were gone. No bodies, no blood, no shattered glass, just an eerie silence left in their place. The register sat open, untouched, with every dollar accounted for. The coffee pot was still half full. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as though business had gone on as usual. And yet, when the morning crew arrived at 6, the station was abandoned, coats left on the hooks, paychecks from the day before still sealed on the counter. It was as though 3 men had been erased from existence. The disappearance rattled the families immediately, but the town itself, accustomed to slow-moving life and whispers that died after a few weeks, swallowed it whole. Police called it a walk-off, maybe even a prank. Some neighbors muttered about a road trip gone wrong, or young men chasing opportunity out of state. But the families knew better. They knew because of the little details. David never left his truck unlocked. Tommy's mother swore he wasn't the kind to run. Mark had barely started his job and owned nothing but the clothes he wore to work. This wasn't flight. It was something else. Something darker. In the days that followed, patrol cars came and went. Officers shined flashlights across gravel lots, and neighbors glanced nervously at each other over diner counters. But nothing surfaced. The evidence that should have been there simply wasn't. No forced entry, no sign of robbery. Just emptiness, silence, and an unlocked back door that shouldn't have been. It was as though the ground itself had opened up and swallowed 3 lives whole. And for years, that's exactly what people believed, that the truth of what happened at that Gulf station was buried somewhere beneath their feet. Time has a way of muting tragedy. By the 1990s, the station was boarded up, its windows covered with plywood, weeds pressing up through cracks in the lot. For decades, people drove past it without a second thought. The building became a backdrop, another forgotten relic of rural decline. But then, in the summer of 2021, nearly 40 years after those men vanished, a demolition crew broke ground on that same property. What began as an ordinary clearance job, remove the old concrete slab, tear out the rusted fuel lines, turned into something else. Something extraordinary. On the 3rd day of work, a backhoe struck metal beneath the dirt, something that wasn't marked on any blueprint. At first, the crew assumed it was an old tank, maybe part of the station's fuel system. But as soil peeled away, what emerged was not a cylinder or pipe. It was square, reinforced, heavy, a hatch sealed with thick bolts and rust that had fused shut over decades. No one on site had ever seen anything like it. By law, they reported it to the zoning office. Within 24 hours, the sheriff's department sealed off the area. When industrial tools finally pried the hatch open, the air that escaped was stale and cold, untouched since the early 1980s. Beneath was not a utility room, not storage. It was a chamber, for bare concrete walls, a ceiling low enough to feel oppressive. A single bulb dangled above, burned out long ago. On the floor, remnants of uniforms, a clipboard with faded writing, and in the corner, the detail that froze every officer on site, 3 worn gas station name tags, each rusted where the pin had once gripped fabric. No bodies, no bones, no remains. But the message was unmistakable. Someone had been down there. 3 someones. And they had never come back out. That discovery reignited everything. Old rumors resurfaced. Families long resigned to grief were thrust back into the agony of unanswered questions. And the town of Darlow, which had quietly tucked the case into the back of its collective memory, was forced to look again at the void in its history. For 4 decades, the official narrative had been simple. 3 men walked away. But the chamber beneath the Gulf station told another story. One written in concrete, silence, and absence. Who built that room? Why did no one know it existed? And why, after all these years, did the county records still show nothing beneath that slab of concrete? Some in town whispered about corruption, about cover-ups that reached higher than anyone dared name. Others muttered something less rational but more chilling. that the ground beneath Darlow had always been wrong, that strange stories from decades earlier had been ignored until the night 3 men went missing. Those old stories had been dismissed as folklore. Unmarked pits discovered on farmland, strange noises rising from beneath storm drains, warnings scribbled by construction workers and quietly buried in county files. They were forgotten, until the hatch proved they weren't just stories after all. In many ways, the 2021 discovery was not just about 3 missing men. It was about the fragility of truth in small towns, how official records could deny what was whispered over coffee, and how silence could last longer than memory. It was about what happens when ordinary lives intersect with something inexplicable, something that resists being explained away. That night in October 1981, the night David, Tommy, and Mark vanished, began like any other. They put on their uniforms, zipped up their jackets against the autumn chill, and clocked in for a shift they never finished. They were not extraordinary men. They were not fugitives or criminals. They were working-class, routine men living routine lives. And maybe that's why their disappearance still chills people today, because if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. By dawn on October 7, 1981, Darlow's quiet routine had already been fractured. The day shift employees arrived at the Gulf station just after 6 a.m. expecting the usual rhythm. Coffee brewing, register balanced, 3 tired faces ready to clock out. Instead, they found silence. The overhead lights still buzzed, but no one stood behind the counter. The drawer of the till was open, though every bill and coin remained. Jackets belonging to the night crew hung neatly on the rack. Their paychecks, dated the previous day, were still sealed in envelopes. The coffee pot was warm, half full, 3 cups already used and tossed into the trash. And outside, in the gravel lot, David Rohr's truck sat untouched, keys in the ignition, new tires freshly fitted, radio dialed to his favorite AM station. Nothing had been stolen, nothing had been broken, and yet, everything was wrong. The first patrolman on the scene radioed in his impression. Looks like they walked off the job. Maybe a prank. Maybe drinking. Maybe nothing worth writing up. But the families didn't buy it. By 8 a.m., David's father was already pounding his fists on the counter, insisting his son wasn't the type to vanish. He listed the details. Dentist appointment scheduled, bills waiting at home, a man too reliable to leave the register open. Minutes later, Tommy's mother pulled into the lot, tears already streaming before she even stepped out of the car. "He's not the kind of boy who runs," she kept repeating, clinging to a belief no amount of rumor could break. By mid-morning, the owner of the Gulf station, Jack Kessler, arrived to unlock the back office. He confirmed what everyone already knew. Nothing was missing. No siphon gas, no stolen parts, no missing cash. But one small detail stood out. The back storage door, normally kept bolted, was found unlatched. Not forced, not broken, just left open. It was the only detail that suggested movement beyond the ordinary. The police filed their report. 3 adult males. No evidence of foul play. No broken locks, no forced entry, no signs of violence. Number 911 calls had been placed during the night. With nothing to anchor an investigation, the case was stamped as a voluntary disappearance and handed off to the sheriff's office for follow-up. That follow-up barely came. In small towns, stories die quickly when there's nothing new to feed them. After a few weeks, most people in Darlow stopped asking. Rumors floated thin as cigarette smoke. Some said the men had run off to Texas chasing construction jobs. Others claimed it was about a woman, a love triangle gone wrong that ended in secret departure. But none of it held water. The families didn't believe it, and deep down, neither did the few officers who had seen the empty station that morning. One of them, Deputy Glenn Mercer, only 3 years into the job, kept digging. He interviewed relatives, checked bank accounts, traced DMV records. Nothing suggested a plan to leave. No cash withdrawn, no bags packed, no calls from the station's payphone. His first report closed with a sentence that still raises chills. No sign of foul play, but doesn't feel like a voluntary disappearance. Recommend further review. But that review never happened. Within a week, Mercer was pulled off the case. A senior detective named Calvin Price replaced him. Price filed one brief summary after interviewing Kessler, the manager. 3 men likely chose to leave their lives behind. No further action unless new information surfaces. And with that, the case was shelved. To an outsider, the speed of dismissal might look like efficiency. But in Darlow, it felt like avoidance. A family torn apart by grief. A small-town department unwilling to shoulder the weight of something that didn't fit into neat paperwork. For the next 40 years, the official stance was silence. And yet, silence leaves traces. Families never moved on. They kept photographs pinned above mantels, kept empty chairs at Thanksgiving tables. David's sister, Elliot's mother, kept a box in her attic with his belongings sealed away, too painful to open but impossible to throw out. Tommy's younger sister held onto a notebook he had filled with restless writing just weeks before he vanished. A notebook that would later be lost in a house fire, leaving behind only the memory that he wasn't finished saying something. Mark's few friends recalled a quiet man who didn't talk much, who had no enemies, but who often stared out at the back lot when he thought no one noticed, as though waiting for something. The case should have ended there, buried by time. But whispers linger. In diner booths and on front porches, people muttered about a dark-colored pickup parked behind the station that night, lights off, waiting. A teenager swore he saw a man in a leather coat pacing near the bushes, tall, deliberate, not drunk, not lost, just watching. His statement was dismissed. Underage, unreliable witness. And then there was the fire, barely 2 weeks after the disappearance, when the old storage shed behind the gas station erupted in flames at 4 in the morning. The building was reduced to ash before firefighters could respond. Inside, according to prior inspection reports, had been boxes of old employee files, equipment logs, and maintenance records, documents that might have tied the Gulf station to something more. All gone. Officially, the fire marshal ruled it undetermined. But to the families, it felt like erasure. Decades later, when Elliot Crane, nephew of David Rohr, returned to Darlow after the 2021 discovery, he would uncover the detail that Deputy Mercer had scribbled in the margin of his final case note. Never filed, never acknowledged. Feels like something under the surface here, something we weren't supposed to find. It was a sentence that would haunt Elliot as he stepped back into a town that had tried for years to forget what had happened. A town where silence had replaced truth, and where 3 young men had simply disappeared into the dark. For nearly 4 decades, Darlow carried the absence of those 3 men like a scar it refused to acknowledge. The gas station sat abandoned, a boarded-up husk on Route 6, while families grieved in silence and whispers of conspiracy drifted through the town like smoke. By the late 1990s, the Gulf station was finally shuttered for good after an EPA inspection uncovered fuel tank leakage. It stood vacant for years, a crumbling monument to the night when routine turned into a riddle. The official files gathered dust in county archives, labeled voluntary disappearance, as if the simple act of classification could erase the horror of 3 lives cut off mid-shift. But time has a way of reopening what's been sealed, and in 2021, the ground itself broke its silence. That summer, a demolition crew contracted by a local hardware chain rolled their heavy equipment onto the lot. The task was straightforward. Clear the slab, remove any lingering underground piping, make space for a parking expansion. But on the 3rd day, a backhoe struck something that no blueprint had marked. The foreman assumed it was a support block. Yet as dirt fell away, the edges revealed themselves not as natural stone, but reinforced concrete. Then the unmistakable outline of a steel hatch, bolted shut, its handle rusted to the frame. The crew halted work and notified the zoning office. By law, the discovery of an unknown underground chamber had to be investigated. Within hours, the sheriff's department cordoned off the area. It took industrial tools to crack the hatch open. Bolts sliced through with grinders, hinges pried until metal screamed. When it finally gave way, what lay beneath was a concrete room, roughly the size of a small office. The air that rose was cold and stale, untouched for 40 years. Inside, officers found fragments. Faded uniforms, a clipboard with illegible writing, a rusted stool. And in the corner, 3 gas station name tags. Each bore a name: David, Tommy, Mark. The metal pins behind them were rust-stained, as though once anchored to fabric now long gone. There were no bones, no remains, nothing that would grant closure. But the implication was unmistakable. This was not coincidence. This was not rumor. This was the place where 3 men had gone and never returned. News of the hatch spread quickly. For the families, it was like reopening an old wound that had never healed. For the town, it was an unwelcome reminder of something it had chosen to bury, both figuratively and literally. And for one man, the discovery was personal. Elliot Crane had left Missouri years earlier, building a career as an investigative journalist. He'd cut his teeth on crime reporting, learned how to sift through lies and silence, and eventually turned to long-form pieces that probed forgotten histories and unresolved mysteries. He never thought he'd return to Darlow. But when his cousin Wendy left a voicemail saying, they found something under the old Gulf station, the one where Uncle David worked, Elliot knew he had no choice. The memory of his uncle was fragile but powerful. Elliot had been only 6 years old in 1981, too young to understand why his mother wept night after night, too young to grasp why the family stopped mentioning David's name. He remembered fragments. His uncle's laugh, the way he lit fireworks on the porch with a lighter etched with Missouri's slogan, "Show me state." Then one night David was gone, and silence replaced him. For 40 years the silence remained. Until now, when Elliot pulled back into Darlow in the summer of 2021, the town hadn't changed much. 2 stoplights, a diner with sun-faded curtains, a main street that seemed to exist outside of time. He parked outside his late aunt's house, where his mother's sister, David's sibling, still lived. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's real, Elliot," she told him. "The sheriff's people said there was a room under the station. They won't say much, but one of the crewmen told my son-in-law there were name tags down there. 3 of them. One said David." The weight of her words crushed him. That night, Elliot unpacked his old tools of the trade, a notepad, a recorder, a camera with a cracked lens. He didn't know exactly what he was chasing, but he knew he couldn't leave until he found out why his uncle and 2 others had been erased from history. As the house creaked in the night, Elliot wandered into the attic, drawn not by logic but by the nagging pull of memory. Dust-covered boxes sat forgotten, their cardboard peeling at the edges. Behind an old bed frame, he found a crate collapsed under its own weight. On the lid, in black marker now faded but still legible, was a name: David. Inside the crate, beneath photographs and a Gulf uniform patch, was a worn envelope marked in shaky handwriting. "If anything happens to me." Elliot sat cross-legged on the wooden boards, his flashlight balanced against his knee. Inside the envelope was a cassette tape labeled October 6th, the day before the disappearance. And behind it, a photograph. 3 men in Gulf uniforms standing in front of the station pumps. David in the middle, Tommy on the left, Mark on the right. On the back, in David's handwriting, the words, "Last shift before it all changes." The cassette would prove more valuable than anyone realized. But even in that moment, holding the tape in his hand, Elliot felt it. The past pressing into the present, 40 years collapsing into a single question. What had his uncle known the day before he vanished? The cassette in Elliot's hands was more than just plastic and tape. It was a time capsule, a voice frozen on the eve of disappearance. But he didn't play it yet. He knew from years of investigative work that timing mattered, that sometimes you had to build the foundation before you uncovered the secret. Instead, he studied the photograph again, the one labeled "Last Shift Before It All Changes." David's expression was relaxed, almost defiant, as though he knew something no one else did. Tommy looked distracted, eyes narrowed, like his thoughts were elsewhere. Mark, the newest employee, stood stiff and uncertain, as if he was still learning how to fit into this small-town rhythm. 3 men caught in a moment that would soon become a ghost story. Elliot began by reconstructing who they had been, because in cold cases, the dead and missing deserve more than just names in a file. They deserved to be known. David Rohr was 29. For 5 years he had worked at the Gulf station, dependable to a fault. Friends described him as quiet, disciplined, with a dry humor that only surfaced once you earned his trust. He lived with his sister, Elliot's mother. After a failed relationship left him with nowhere else to go, he didn't drink, didn't gamble, and never shirked responsibility. He was, in every way, the opposite of a man likely to abandon his life without explanation. Tommy Geller was younger, only 20. He had tried college in Springfield but dropped out after a year. Some said he carried a chip on his shoulder. Others claimed he just wasn't cut out for classrooms. He worked the night shift to avoid clashing with his parents, saving money for a car he desperately wanted. Sharp-witted, sometimes sarcastic, Tommy was the type who seemed restless, like he wanted more than Darlow could offer. In the fall of 1981, he had started scribbling in a notebook, filling it with ideas and fragments no one ever saw again. That notebook would vanish along with him. Mark Dunley, 25, was the newcomer. Rumors placed him from Ohio, drifting between mechanic jobs before ending up in Darlow 2 months earlier. He was soft-spoken, perhaps lonely, but diligent. His manager liked him because he didn't ask stupid questions. He paid rent in cash for a small room above the old post office and never missed a shift. To the locals, he was barely known. Just another working man passing through. 3 men, 3 lives. No criminal records, no debts, no enemies. No clear reason to vanish. What they shared was routine, and that routine is what makes their disappearance all the more unsettling. Because routine is predictable. Routine is safe. And yet, routine is also the perfect trap. Elliot tracked down what little remained of the official records. Customers had been interviewed in 1981, though few remembered much. One man, John Price, a delivery driver from Kansas City, recalled stopping at the Gulf station around 1:40 a.m. He spoke briefly with a young employee, later identified as Tommy, who seemed distracted, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone. The station was well lit, pumps running, nothing unusual. Price paid in cash and left. That was the last confirmed sighting of any of the 3 men alive. Another name surfaced from police notes, Georgia Lane, then 43. Around midnight, she had called the station, asking if she'd left her purse there earlier in the evening. A calm male voice told her no, but promised to check again. She remembered the voice as tired, polite. She thought nothing of it then. But years later, when Elliot found her, Georgia admitted she hadn't told the police everything, because just before the line cut out, she heard another voice in the background, faint, frantic, saying only one word, "Don't." That single word reframed the entire case. It meant the men hadn't simply vanished into thin air. At least one of them had still been alive and present inside the station when Georgia made that call. So, then who answered the phone? Adding to the mystery was an unsigned statement in the case file describing a pickup truck parked in the back lot around 2 a.m. lights off, engine quiet. The witness didn't stop, only noticed it while driving by. Police never followed up. It was just another dangling thread, ignored and eventually forgotten. But perhaps the strangest account came from a teenager, 17-year-old Calvin Drake, who had been smoking outside the all-night diner near Route 6. He told Deputy Mercer that he saw a tall man in a leather coat standing by the bushes behind the Gulf station. The figure wasn't drunk or loitering. He moved with purpose, twice spotted between 1:15 and 1:50 a.m., walking toward the garage area at the back. Calvin assumed he was an employee, but he never saw his face. His statement was dismissed. Unreliable, underage witness. No sketch was drawn, no further questions asked. But what haunts the record is the location, the back lot, the exact place where, for decades later, the underground hatch would be found. For Elliot, these details weren't just scraps. They were patterns. A pickup with lights off, a man in a leather coat, a back door unlatched, a frightened voice on the phone, all pointing to something happening not in the public-facing space of the station, but behind it, in the shadows, where the ground itself hid secrets. By his 3rd day in Darlow, Elliot had secured access to the old audio interviews recorded in 1981. Tape hiss gave way to the gravelly voice of station manager Jack Kessler, describing his arrival that morning. Everything was normal, too normal. Register open, coffee still warm, nobody in sight. When pressed if anything was out of place, Kessler hesitated. Yeah, the back storage door was unlatched. We don't leave it that way, ever. Then, leaning in close to the microphone, he added something that would never appear in the typed report. When I first took over the station in '74, we had a sump pump back up, flooded half the back room. When we cleared it, I noticed a patch of concrete that didn't match the rest of the slab, like it was poured later. Didn't think much of it. Now I do. The interview ended abruptly. A note on the tape's label read, "Follow-up canceled. Subject requested no further contact." That mismatched slab, Kessler's unease, the unlatched door, all pointed to the same conclusion. The ground beneath the Gulf station held something hidden, something never meant to be found. And then came the fire. 12 days after the men disappeared, at 4 a.m., the shed behind the station erupted in flames. It was small, just a wooden utility shack with a metal roof, but inside it held boxes of old employee files and mechanical reports dating back over a decade. All of it was destroyed. Officially, the fire marshal listed the cause as undetermined. But firefighters on scene noted 3 troubling details. The blaze had burned unusually hot and fast. The door latch appeared pried open before the fire, and a neighbor reported seeing a dark-colored vehicle near the fence an hour before the flames. No investigation followed. The report was filed under non-criminal property loss. To Elliot, the timing was unmistakable. It wasn't just a fire. It was a cleanup. By the 4th day of his stay in Darlow, Elliot had moved past interviews and family stories. He wanted hard evidence, paper trails, the kind of details small-town officials often misfiled or forgot to shred. That's how he found himself inside the county records warehouse, a dusty building where stacks of folders and reels of film sat in long-forgotten cabinets. The air smelled of mildew and old ink. Most files were dull zoning permits, tax receipts, occupancy certificates. But tucked inside a yellowed envelope marked Gulf Station, October 1981, Elliot found something extraordinary. A small reel of 8mm film labeled SAM-3. It wasn't videotape but silent surveillance film, the kind used in older security systems. Elliot signed it out and drove to Springfield, where a retired colleague still owned a reel-to-digital converter. They processed the film frame by frame, watching in silence as grainy images appeared on the screen. The footage showed the back lot of the Gulf Station, time-stamped between midnight and 2 a.m. For most of the reel, nothing happened. Shadows swayed under a pole light. Trucks hummed faintly along the highway. Then, at 1:50 a.m., movement. A figure stepped into the frame, male, broad-shouldered, clothed in dark fabric. He stood still, facing the back of the building, watching. For nearly 30 seconds he didn't move, just stared, before walking out of frame. Minutes later, another figure appeared. This one crouched low, moving with deliberate steps near the gravel path. Then, in a motion both subtle and chilling, he seemed to slip into a recess in the ground. Not a hole, not a ditch, but something engineered, like an entryway. Elliot froze the frame. The shadowy dip aligned exactly with where, 40 years later, the construction crew had unearthed the hatch. The camera ended its recording at 2:04 a.m., never capturing the workers leaving, never showing their return. Just silence, and the last glimpse of movement around the very spot that would become their grave. The film was proof. Not just rumor, not just forgotten witness statements. Proof that someone was at the Gulf Station that night, entering the ground beneath it. Proof that what swallowed those men was not accident, but intent. Elliot returned to the site the next morning. The Gulf Station was smaller than he remembered from childhood. The canopy over the pumps had collapsed years ago, leaving only rusted steel beams rising from stained concrete. Weeds sprouted through every crack. Windows were boarded with warped plywood. The front door hung chained but useless. A yellow zoning notice fluttered in the breeze. He stood still, listening. The silence was heavy, broken only by the low hum of power lines overhead. No cars passed for nearly 10 minutes. The property was a husk, stripped of meaning, abandoned by memory. And yet, behind it he knew something waited. At the rear lot, he found the new steel hatch the county had installed over the opening discovered by the demolition crew. A blue tarp flapped weakly, weighed down by concrete blocks. Elliot crouched, running his fingers over the cold surface. He imagined David, Tommy, and Mark standing there 40 years earlier, alive, unaware that beneath their feet lay a trap waiting to be opened. With effort, Elliot pried the hatch open. The hinges groaned, echoing off the empty structure. A ladder descended 12 feet into a concrete room. The air was dry, tinged with dust. He lowered himself slowly until his boots hit the hard floor. The chamber was bare. For concrete walls, nothing more than anchors along the base where shelving might once have stood. No pipes, no drains, no wires. In the far left corner sat a small pile sealed inside an evidence bag left behind by the sheriff's team. Elliot opened it carefully. 3 items. A Gulf gas station name tag. Bent, rusting at the pin. The lettering still faintly legible. David. A digital watch, frozen at 1:56 a.m. A cigarette lighter. Missouri's Show Me State. Slogan etched on its side, chipped and blackened near the hinge. The watch might have simply died when its battery drained, but its precise time was unnerving. 1:56 a.m. A moment caught and preserved, long after the men themselves were gone. Elliot's flashlight swept across the wall near the ladder. There, beneath years of dust, was a black mark. A single number, 4. The missing men had been 3. Who, or what was the 4th? He pressed his sleeve against the wall and brushed away more grime. Scratch marks emerged, deliberate, not random. For tallies with a 5th line slashed across, the kind prisoners carve into stone to count days. Someone had been here, marking time, trapped in silence. Elliot stood still, the lighter heavy in his palm. He remembered seeing David flick it open one summer, grin on his face as he lit fireworks in the backyard. That memory clashed with the lifeless chamber, with the tally marks etched in desperation. This wasn't storage. It wasn't shelter. It was containment. He climbed out of the chamber, breath unsteady. He didn't know yet if what killed the men was human or something else entirely. But he knew now the official story was a lie. They hadn't walked away. They hadn't run. They had been taken. And the concrete slab was built to hide not just their disappearance, but what lay beneath. That night, Elliot drove to a community college audio lab in Springfield. In his bag was the cassette tape he had found in David's attic box, labeled October 6th, the night before the disappearances. He slid it into the deck. First, nothing but static. Then a voice, nervous, shaky. "Okay, this should be rolling now. Dave, if you find this, don't tell Jack. Just listen." It was Tommy. "We were checking the storage drain after the rain. The one behind the lot. Mark thinks there's a crawl space under it, sealed up. We found old hinges, maybe a panel. Concrete's weird. Newer than the rest, patched over. We're gonna take another look tonight. If I'm wrong, fine, I owe you a beer. But if I'm not..." The tape crackled, and Tommy's voice dropped lower. "Mark's been jumpy all day. Keeps saying he hears a hum like a generator, but there's nothing back there. Nothing we can see anyway." Then a pause, followed by final words that felt like a knife to Elliot's chest. "If we're not back by sunrise, maybe check under the slab." The tape clicked off. Silence filled the room. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't drunken rambling. It was a warning, one no one had ever heard until now. The cassette changed everything. It wasn't just a relic. It was a voice from the past whispering across 40 years. A young man's fear recorded on cheap magnetic tape. For Elliot, it was confirmation that his uncle and his co-workers hadn't walked into the night willingly. They had gone looking for something beneath that station, and whatever they found had taken them instead. The next step was clear. If anyone could shed light on those early days, it was Glenn Mercer, the young deputy who had first handled the case in 1981. Elliot drove south to Osceola, 2 hours from Darlow, where Mercer lived in retirement. The man who answered the door was older now, moving with a limp, but his eyes were sharp, unclouded by time. "I was wondering when someone in that family would come knocking," Mercer said, his voice carrying both weariness and relief. They sat on his back porch, no recorder, just Elliot's notepad. Mercer didn't waste time with theories of ghosts or conspiracies. Instead, he spoke about procedure, about what should have happened but didn't. 3 grown men disappear. No sign of a fight, nothing stolen. No one talks. And they shut me down after 2 weeks. Told me it wasn't foul play, told me to stop asking. But I'd seen the maps. That slab wasn't in the original plans. I flagged it, asked the owner about it. He clammed up. Then a week later, the shed burns, all the files gone. Elliot pressed him. Did Mercer believe the men had been murdered? The old deputy shook his head slowly. No, I think it was something worse. He wouldn't elaborate. He only handed Elliot a worn legal pad filled with notes he had kept since 1981. Names, dates, observations, breadcrumbs Mercer had saved against the silence of official reports. Back in Darlow, Elliot carried the pad to the county planning office. The clerk, surprised at his request, produced a single folder for the Gulf station. Inside were only the basics: ownership deeds, a fuel compliance certificate, and one rough diagram of the building. But tucked at the bottom was a torn invoice. It was dated September 1979, 2 years before the disappearance. The order read, cement delivery, reinforced grade. Location, rear lot. Work order, 781 restrict. No contractor name, no signature, just a cryptic phone number. Elliot traced it to a construction firm long dissolved, Thompson and Ellis Contracting. In 1985, the company's owner had been convicted of illegal waste dumping in rural Missouri. There were no other records. It was as if the company and its projects had been buried along with the concrete it poured. That word on the invoice, restrict, lingered in Elliot's mind. This wasn't a casual work order. It was a directive, and it carried the weight of secrecy. Someone had ordered a reinforced slab poured at the back of the Gulf station 2 years before 3 men disappeared above it. The deeper Elliot dug, the more he found people who had noticed details but never shared them fully. One of them was Georgia Lane, the woman who had called about her purse the night of the disappearance. Elliot visited her at her modest home just outside town. Georgia, now in her 80s, remembered David and his co-workers fondly. She listened quietly as Elliot explained the chamber, the tape, the photographs. When he mentioned her midnight call, her eyes darkened. "I never told the cops everything," she admitted. "Didn't want to sound crazy." She described how, after she asked about her purse, a man with a deep voice, older, polite, not one of the young employees, told her they hadn't seen it. Then she heard it, banging in the background, like metal striking metal. And over it, a frightened voice, far away, saying, "Don't." A moment later, the line clicked dead. For 40 years, Georgia had carried that memory alone. Now, hearing her confess it, Elliot realized the horrifying implication. The men were still alive when she called. Alive, restrained, somewhere in that building, while another man, someone older, someone who didn't belong, answered the phone for them. The puzzle grew sharper. This wasn't just disappearance. It was control. Someone had been inside the station with them, managing their absence as though it had been planned. That night, Elliot returned to his aunt's house, the attic box beside him. He sifted through the photographs again, searching for something he had missed. One image, taken on October 5th, 2 days before the disappearance, showed the 3 men standing outside the pumps in uniform. At first glance, it was unremarkable, but as Elliot zoomed in, the details sharpened. In the open garage behind them, faint but visible, was a rectangle cut into the concrete floor, a hatch, and beside it, barely in frame, the polished toe of a black dress shoe. Not sneakers, not work boots, a shoe that didn't belong to any of the 3 men. Someone had been standing just inside the garage when the photo was taken, watching, hiding. A presence lurking in plain sight. As if that weren't enough, Elliot discovered a folded receipt tucked between 2 old pay stubs. It was dated October 2nd, 1981, just days before the men vanished. Purchased items: a flashlight, WD-40, and a hinge kit. The handwriting on the back was David's. For turns left from light. Tap twice, then push. 12 in for down. Numbers lie. Names don't. If it's not shut, don't go in. Elliot stared at the cryptic note. Was it a code? Directions? A warning? He showed it to a retired cryptographer who studied Cold War ciphers. After an hour, the man leaned back. Not a code. Directions. Physical instructions. For turns, tapping, pushing. A sequence to open something mechanical. 12 in for down. Inches, probably. A wall panel or hatch. The last line, though. If it's not shut, don't go in. That's not instruction. That's fear. For Elliot, the pieces were forming a terrifying picture. His uncle and the others had known about the hatch before that night. They had been preparing to open it. And David had left behind a riddle that sounded less like curiosity and more like a last plea. The Gulf station wasn't the mystery. It was the lid. By now, Elliot understood that what had happened at the Gulf station was no accident. Every clue pointed to deliberation. Concrete poured where it didn't belong. A fire timed to erase records. Cryptic warnings hidden in receipts. But he still lacked the larger picture. What was the hatch hiding, and why had so many people been willing to look the other way? To answer that, he turned to a resource few investigators ever considered. The town's water and sewer archives. Darlow, like many rural Missouri towns, had grown in fits and starts. Utility systems were often cobbled together, old storm drains layered beneath new construction. With the help of a retired worker named Dennis Pike, Elliot sifted through blueprints dating back to the early 1950s. The diagrams were fragile, ink faded, edges crumbling. But one map, dated 1952, stopped them both cold. Running directly beneath what would later become the Gulf Station was a tunnel labeled Secondary Storm Access. Closed 1964. The line sloped downward, 5 feet wide, toward the western edge of the property. 2 vertical vents connected to it, both marked sealed. And scrawled in red pencil near the station's footprint were 3 chilling words. Do not dig. That's not an official note, Pike muttered, tapping the faded letters. That's a contractor's warning. Someone found something down there and didn't want it uncovered. The implications were staggering. The underground chamber discovered in 2021 wasn't new. It predated the station itself, meaning whoever built the Gulf in the 1960s knew about it and chose to build over it anyway. That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., under cover of darkness, he returned to the site with nothing more than gloves, a flashlight, and David's cryptic note. He descended the steel ladder into the chamber once again. This time, he wasn't just observing. He was following instructions. He started at the flashlight fixture on the ceiling beam, his assumed light. For steps left, he crouched, tapped the wall twice. The sound changed, less dull, more hollow. Measuring 12 inches inward, for inches down, his hand brushed something almost invisible. A tiny rusted handle flush with the concrete. He pulled. At first nothing, then a sudden metallic click. The panel shifted. Behind it was a crawl space, vent-sized, descending at a steep angle. The air that escaped was stale but dry, preserved by decades of isolation. Elliot squeezed inside, flashlight trembling. The narrow tunnel bent twice before widening into a void. This wasn't a room. It was a cavern carved from raw earth and stone. The walls bore frantic scratches, hundreds of them, metallic glints catching the beam. In one corner lay a rusted pry bar, its edge dulled by desperate attempts to dig out. A half-collapsed wooden bunk sat against the far wall beside a buried metal crate and shattered glass bottle. But at the center of the floor was something unnatural. A circular patch of earth, perfectly smooth, unnaturally dark, as though scorched. Elliot knelt, heart pounding, and shined his light. Embedded in the soil was a cracked ID badge clipped to a rusted chain. He brushed the dirt away and read the name. Mark Dunley. The chamber was no myth. The missing men had been there. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was where they were taken. And the real question wasn't just who brought them there, but what this place had been built for. Elliot left the chamber at dawn, exhausted, starving, but unwilling to rest. He drove straight to the county library, where archives of local newspapers and reports were kept on microfilm. He wanted to know if Darlow had ever seen anything like this before. Buried in a box marked Miscellaneous Civil Incidents, he found a report dated July 1953. A rail maintenance worker named Frank Barron had filed it after falling 6 feet into an unmarked pit near the western edge of town. He described it as a stone-walled chamber, too precise to be natural. County surveyors dismissed it as a collapsed foundation from an old smokehouse. Unsatisfied, Barron added a handwritten note to the file. Too deep for a smokehouse. Smooth walls, built for keeping something in or out. The site was quietly filled in. No photos, no follow-up. Elliot cross-referenced the map with modern layouts. That chamber sat only half a mile from the Gulf Station. A straight line between them crossed residential land and the abandoned grain co-op. 3 sealed locations decades apart, each hidden, each ignored. This wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was a pattern. And then he found something even stranger. Buried in school records from October 1981 was a scheduled fire drill, held not during the day, but at 1:30 a.m., the night before the Gulf employees vanished. No explanation, no weather warnings, no testing, just a list of students marked present. One name stood out, Timothy Kessler, the son of station manager Jack Kessler. According to the record, Timothy was excused early due to a family matter. The timing was uncanny. On the night David and his co-workers were preparing to open the hatch, the station manager's son was pulled from school in the middle of the night. Less than 24 hours later, 3 men were gone. Elliot sat with the file in silence, the edges of his theory forming. What if the fire drill wasn't about evacuation, but diversion? And what if the Kesslers had known about the hatch all along? The name Kessler hung in Elliot's mind like a weight he couldn't shake. Jack Kessler had managed the Gulf Station in 1981, had been the one to unlock the back office that morning, had admitted to noticing mismatched concrete years earlier. And now his son Timothy's name surfaced, excused from a bizarre midnight school drill just hours before 3 men vanished. Elliot couldn't ignore it. He drove to the Kessler residence on the edge of town, a modest 1-story ranch with beige siding, the kind of house that looked more empty than lived in. Timothy answered the door. 60 now, thin, weathered, moving more slowly than a man his age should. For a moment, the two just stared. Then Elliot spoke. "I'm David Rohr's nephew." The name struck Timothy like a blow. His mouth twitched, his eyes darkened, but he didn't close the door. "You're digging up something that never should have been uncovered," he said flatly. "There's a reason people buried it." 3 men didn't move on, Elliot replied quietly. "They're still buried in silence. Someone needs to tell me why." Timothy's gaze shifted to the floor. His voice was low, almost ashamed. "Because they went where they shouldn't have, and my father tried to keep it sealed. He didn't build it, but he knew it was there. Same as others before him. You think you're the first to try and open that hatch? You're not. They tried in 71. Tried in 64. It never ends well." Elliot's breath caught. "So what happened that night?" Timothy paused, then shook his head. "He gave them a chance to walk away. They didn't take it. And with that, he closed the door." The words echoed in Elliot's head as he walked back to his car. What did Timothy mean by "he gave them a chance"? Who was he? Was it Jack, the father, or someone else entirely? The vague confession didn't answer anything. It only deepened the void. Later that evening, an envelope arrived at Elliot's aunt's house. No return address, no postmark, just his name written in block capitals. Inside was a photocopy of a police memo stamped confidential, dated October 20th, 1981, 13 days after the disappearance. The subject line, "Internal Review of Gulf Station Case, Field Summary from Lieutenant Monroe." The memo was short. The first paragraph confirmed what Elliot already knew. Original entry chamber confirmed. No further search conducted beyond ground level. Deputy Mercer's concerns dismissed. Case closed as unexplained disappearance. But the second paragraph was damning. Request from Kessler, MGR, to delay demolition of rear lot denied. Alternate solution proposed by code enforcement. Seal existing chamber with reinforced concrete. No press release. Deed transfer to Darlow County. They hadn't just overlooked the chamber. They had debated what to do with it and chosen burial. Not ignorance, deliberate concealment. Someone in authority had decided to pour concrete over the hatch and leave the truth underground. The memo confirmed Elliot's growing fear. The Gulf Station had been built over something no one wanted exposed. And when 3 men stumbled too close to it, silence became policy. Back in the archives, Elliot searched through pre-1970 surveyor's maps. On one blueprint, faded in the margin, he spotted a notation. Cavity DNR 2. No entrance. No exit. No record of purpose. Just a rectangle drawn beneath the lot. And beside it, in faint handwriting, no access. The sealed room Elliot had already found wasn't the only one. There was another. DNR 2 lay 20 feet underground, just east of the slab. No crawl space, no mapped connection. Nothing unless you knew where to look. Night fell as Elliot returned to the station. He paced the lot, blueprints in hand, measuring distances against rusted posts and broken pavement. At 3 a.m., his boot struck something hollow. Brushing dirt aside, he uncovered a rust-colored steel plate, fused to the ground. No handle, no hinges, just a seam. Beneath it was DNR 2. It took him hours of prying with tools before the plate gave way. The air that escaped was heavy, as if the earth itself exhaled. A ladder descended into darkness. Elliot lowered himself carefully, flashlight in hand. This wasn't like the crude chamber above. The walls here were engineered, lined with thin metal ribs. The room was larger, 20 feet wide, 10 feet high. Dust coated the floor, untouched for decades. Against the far wall, bolted to the ground, was a chair. Restraint cuffs hung from its arms. Above it, a spotlight. Beside the chair, a small metal table. On it lay a notebook, its pages fused from moisture, but one still legible. The words, written in block letters, made Elliot's blood run cold. Do not speak to it. Do not answer. If it remembers your name, leave immediately. His beam shifted to the wall behind the chair. Etched into the metal were 3 letters, Dr. David Rohr. And beneath them, faint but unmistakable, we weren't alone. The chair was wrong. Elliot stood frozen, staring at its steel cuffs, the spotlight angled down like an interrogation lamp. It wasn't police equipment, and it wasn't medical either. It was something in between, built for containment. He shivered. The air was dry, unmoving, yet heavy with the sense of a presence long departed, or still waiting. The notebook was brittle, its cover flaking in his hands. Most of the pages were ruined, glued together by moisture and time, but a few words were still legible. One note read, "It responds to memory triggers. Names, places, smells. Once it starts speaking, do not engage. Acknowledgement accelerates cognition." Another page, scrawled in a more frantic hand. "It mimics voices. It doesn't understand death. Keeps asking about the others. Thinks they're still here." Elliot sat back on his heels, chilled to the bone. The message wasn't describing a prisoner. It was describing something else, something capable of speaking and learning. Something that remembered. He turned the beam of his flashlight back to the wall. The scratches of Dr. His uncle's initials were deliberate. Beneath them, we weren't alone. The words didn't read like metaphor or poetry. They read like testimony. His uncle had been here in this chamber, aware that something else shared the space. Elliot's breath quickened as he glanced at the tape recorder in his bag. He hadn't listened to side B of the cassette yet, assuming it was blank. Now every instinct screamed that it wasn't. He left the chamber, sealing the hatch behind him, and drove to Springfield under the cover of night. At the community college audio lab, he slid the tape into the deck and flipped it. Static hissed, then footsteps echoed faintly. 3 sets, boots scraping against concrete. A voice spoke, unmistakable. Tommy Geller. "Okay, we're at the hatch. Mark's going to pop it. David's got the flashlight." A loud metallic clang rang out, followed by the grinding scrape of a door opening. More footsteps. A pause. Mark's voice came through, low and uneasy. This place is bigger than it looks. The floor's different, smooth, like new concrete. Hold on. Then silence, except for breathing, quick and nervous. Tommy whispered, "What is that?" The tape warbled, then picked up a sound that didn't belong. A clicking rhythm, almost mechanical, faint but steady. "Shut up. Shut up." David's voice was tight with fear. "Do you hear that?" Then, impossibly, another voice entered. Not theirs. Not human, not fully. A whisper, low and almost gentle, distorted by the tape, but still clear enough to slice into Elliot's chest. "Did you come back for me?" The men gasped, cursed. Metal clattered. A shout. Frantic. "Run!" Then chaos. Scuffling, scraping, the sharp crash of something heavy falling. And then, abruptly, static. The tape ended in silence. Elliot sat alone in the dark lab, the echo of that voice crawling through his head. It hadn't been a monster's roar or a scream from the abyss. It was a plea, soft and desperate, the voice of something aware. "Did you come back for me?" Not a threat. A question. The notebook's warning made sense now. It didn't understand death. It thought the others were still alive. And when it spoke, it wasn't just noise, it was reaching for connection. Whoever or whatever had been sealed beneath the Gulf station wasn't gone. It had been waiting. Back in Darlow, Elliot visited Deputy Mercer again. On the porch, he played him side B of the tape. The old man listened without expression, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed the Gulf station under construction in 1970. Workers in hard hats stood by rebar and trenches. At the bottom of the image, almost hidden by shadow, was a hatch, already there, long before the station poured its foundation. "I tried to show this to the captain back then," Mercer said. "He told me it was a trick of the light, told me I needed a break. But I knew what I saw. That hatch wasn't built by us. It was there before." Elliot's skin prickled. The Gulf station hadn't been constructed over an accident. It had been deliberately planted over an existing structure, a structure people in authority already knew about. That night, Elliot spread his evidence across the motel bed. The cassette, the notebook, the invoices, the photograph. It all pointed to the same conclusion. The disappearances hadn't been random, and they hadn't been misunderstood. They had been the result of a choice. Someone in 1981 had decided it was better to bury the truth than expose what lived beneath. And now Elliot faced the same decision. If he published what he'd found, the story would explode. Headlines would scream about buried chambers and strange voices. But the tape's whisper lingered in his mind. "Did you come back for me?" It wasn't finished. Whatever had been sealed away was still waiting, still listening. Elliot didn't sleep after hearing the tape. The whisper looped in his mind like a curse. "Did you come back for me?" It was neither malevolent nor benign, just hungry in a way words couldn't express. If his uncle and the others had responded even once, it might have been enough to feed that hunger. The notebook's warnings weren't superstition. They were survival instructions. But questions pressed harder than sleep. What had been sealed there before the Gulf station was built? Who had ordered reinforced concrete poured in 1979, 2 years before the disappearance? And most of all, why had the county chosen silence when 3 men vanished right on top of it? The next day, Elliot returned to the records office, demanding access to property surveys that predated the gas station entirely. At first the clerk resisted, but after hours of digging through faded folders, Elliot found it. A surveyor's blueprint from the late 1960s. In the margins was a disconnected rectangle labeled Cavity DNR2. No access points, no explanation. Just a note. No record of purpose. He had already seen DNR2 with his own eyes, beneath the rusted steel plate. He knew what was there. The chair, the restraints, the chilling message etched by his uncle. We weren't alone. But now he understood something deeper. That chamber had been mapped, hidden in plain sight, and ignored for decades. That night, Elliot returned once more to the Gulf station. The air was heavy, the property darker than usual, as though the silence had grown thicker. He crossed the cracked lot, flashlight beam jittering, until it struck the steel plate. It took more force than before to pry it open, as though the earth itself resisted. Descending the ladder into DNR2, Elliot felt the temperature drop. His light swept over the chair, the cuffs, the table with the fused notebook. This time, though, he lingered on the scratches gouged deep into the steel wall. Beyond his uncle's initials, faint lines overlapped, layered. Not one hand, but several over time. Others had been there before 1981. Others had tried to leave a mark, to leave a warning. He set the recorder on the table and pressed play. The hiss of the cassette filled the chamber, then Tommy's voice, then Mark's, then the clicking sound. Elliot froze. For the first time, he noticed something buried under the static. Fainter than before, almost inaudible. A second whisper layered beneath the first. The words blurred, warped, but with the volume raised, he could almost make them out. Don't answer it. His heart thudded in his chest. Someone, maybe David, had tried to fight back, tried to resist whatever spoke from behind the wall. But the men hadn't escaped. The tally marks proved that. Elliot stood in the chamber for what felt like hours, the flashlight beam trembling as though even the air vibrated. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself the one phrase he had read again and again in the ruined notebook. Some truths don't want to be uncovered. When he finally climbed back into the night, dawn was breaking, the horizon painted gray. He knew he couldn't stay in Darlow much longer. The county officials who had granted him access were already wary of his presence. And there was something else, a quiet dread, an intuition built from years of chasing cold cases. He felt like he was being watched. Back at the motel, he laid out every piece of evidence one last time. Photos, receipts, the tape, the blueprints. Then he recorded a final entry on his own device. His voice was steady, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. October 18, 2021. The tape is real. The chambers are real. And whatever was sealed beneath that gas station is still down there. It remembered David's name. That means it remembers others. If you're hearing this, don't dig it up. Don't try to prove me right. Some things wait. And if you answer, they learn. He mailed copies of the evidence to 2 trusted colleagues. One in Chicago with instructions to publish if he went silent. Another to Mercer, the only man who had believed something was wrong in 1981. Then Elliot left Darlow, not saying goodbye to his aunt, not telling anyone where he was headed. Some truths you can't share without destroying the people who carry them. 2 weeks later, his recorder captured one last log entry in a roadside motel near the Arkansas border. I've gone as far as I can. I don't know if it was human. I don't know if it was ever alive. But it asked for David. It will keep asking. Don't answer. Then silence, except, faint in the background, like breath pressed against a wall, the whisper again. Did you come back for me? The case of the 3 men from the Gulf Station remains unsolved. Officially, it is still archived as voluntary disappearance. But beneath the concrete slabs of forgotten towns, silence doesn't mean safety. It means containment. And some things aren't buried to be forgotten. They're buried because they are still waiting. The whisper didn't leave Elliot, even after he crossed state lines. It lingered like a splinter in the brain, a fragment of sound that refused to die. Did you come back for me? The voice wasn't just captured on tape. It followed him, slipping into the quiet between highway static and motel air conditioners. Every journalist learns to compartmentalize, to keep cases from bleeding into their own thoughts, but this one had already taken root. It wasn't only a cold case. It was alive, pulsing, unfinished. Elliot tried to analyze it the way he always did, rationally, methodically. If the voice was mimicry, then maybe the chamber's acoustics distorted the men's shouts. If it was mechanical, perhaps an old generator or faulty pump had produced patterns mistaken for words. But none of that explained the specificity. David's name spoken, the plea for return, the mimicry described in the notebook. And none of it explained why men like Kessler, men in authority, had chosen silence rather than exposure. In his motel room, Elliot pored over the names Mercer had given him in that old legal pad. Former contractors, city surveyors, zoning officers. Most were dead now. A few were alive but untraceable. Yet one name jumped out, a foreman named Harold Keene, who had overseen utility inspections in 1979, the same year reinforced concrete was poured over the rear lot. Elliot drove 6 hours to track him down, a frail man now in a nursing facility. Keene didn't talk much at first, but when Elliot showed him the invoice marked 781 restrict, his hand trembled. "We weren't supposed to ask," he whispered. "The slab wasn't in the blueprints. Came down from the county office. Extra pay, no questions. We poured, we sealed, we left. They said if we kept our mouths shut, we'd get more work." "Did you see what was under it?" Elliot asked. Keene's eyes clouded. "Not all the way, but there was already a space. Cut too clean for a drain, too deep for storage. We covered it up. And then, a few months later, I heard about that station fire. Files gone. That's when I knew." His voice cracked. "We weren't building. We were burying." The confession confirmed what Elliot already suspected. The chambers predated the gas station. They had been there long before, mapped and ignored, covered with concrete each time someone got too close. But why here? Why Darlow? Back at the county library, Elliot dug deeper into old microfilm reels. Local papers from the 1930s reported strange incidents. Livestock found mutilated near storm drains, children warning of voices under the floorboards, unexplained fires in storage sheds. Each time, officials brushed it off as coincidence or hysteria. But the patterns repeated, disturbances followed by sealing, sealing followed by silence. The scariest discovery wasn't what he found in print, but what was missing. Gaps in archives, entire years of planning records stripped clean. Fires at municipal storage buildings in 1947 and 1965, each destroying decades of files. It was a rhythm of erasure. Elliot thought back to Timothy Kessler's words. He gave them a chance to walk away. They didn't take it. Who was he? Was it Jack Kessler, the manager? Or was it something else? Something the Kesslers had been trying to keep sealed for decades? One night, Elliot returned to Mercer's porch. His evidence spread across the table. "This isn't just about my uncle," Elliot said. "This town has been burying something for nearly a century." Mercer's face was pale in the lamplight, but his voice was steady. "You think I don't know that? I saw the maps. I saw the fire reports. But every time I pushed, they shut me down. Darlow didn't want answers. They wanted quiet." "Quiet doesn't last forever," Elliot muttered. Mercer's eyes narrowed. "No, it doesn't. And that's the problem." For Elliot, the problem had already become obsession. He couldn't leave the story behind. Not now. He carried the cassette everywhere, playing it again and again, as though searching for something hidden in the static. And late one night, in the parking lot of another nameless motel, he heard it. Not on the tape. Not through speakers. In the air. A faint whisper curling through the silence. "Did you come back for me?" He spun, heart pounding, flashlight cutting across asphalt. Nothing. Empty road. Empty night. But the voice had been there, clear and close. Elliot knew then that some things don't stay buried. They travel. They follow. And maybe, just maybe, they remember more than names. The whisper followed Elliot into daylight. Even as he tried to rationalize, it seeped into the edges of his thoughts, as if the tape had imprinted itself on him. "Did you come back for me?" The words repeated not only when he pressed play, but in the silence between. It was no longer just a recording, it was a presence. Still, he pressed forward, combing the archive boxes in Darlow's county hall for anything overlooked. That was when he found it. A brittle folder labeled zoning, anomalies, 1950s, 1970s. Inside were handwritten notes from inspectors long dead. Most were mundane. Unsealed septic lines, drainage complaints. But one entry, dated March 1964, was stark. Subterranean chamber discovered during routine survey. Smooth stone unmarked. Residents reported humming beneath floorboards. Ordered sealed. Do not resurvey. It was signed not by an inspector, but by a county commissioner. Elliot traced the signature back and discovered something chilling. The commissioner was Jack Kessler's uncle. A family tie reaching back decades. long before the Gulf station existed. The Kesslers hadn't just managed the gas station. They had been tied to the cover-ups from the beginning. That evening, Elliot drove once more to the Kessler house. This time Timothy didn't answer right away. When he finally opened the door, he looked older, thinner, as though the weight of memory was crushing him. "You should have left," Timothy muttered. "I can't," Elliot replied. "Not when David was my uncle. Not when I know your family has been burying this for generations." Timothy's eyes filled with something between anger and grief. "You think you're helping, but you're not. You're giving it what it wants. Tension, names, memory. What is it?" Elliot demanded. "What's down there?" Timothy's voice cracked. "Not ours. Never was. But once you hear it, it knows you, and it doesn't forget." He slammed the door shut. Elliot stood on the porch, trembling. He thought of the scratches in the walls, of the plea on the tape, of the initials DR etched in steel. His uncle hadn't only been trapped, he'd been recognized. Whatever lived in that chamber had learned his name, and 40 years later it had spoken it again. The deeper Elliot searched, the more the pattern revealed itself. Fires timed to erase records. Reinforced concrete poured over hidden spaces. Witnesses dismissed. And always silence. Not because people didn't know, but because they did. One late night in his motel room, Elliot played the tape yet again. He focused on the background static, the faint spaces between Tommy's words and the clicking sound. And for the first time he heard it, barely audible but there. A voice, broken and distant, whispering something other than the plea. A single word, repeated twice, "hungry." The realization hit him like a blow. The voice wasn't just mimicking. It was craving. It wanted acknowledgement. It wanted to be answered. And every time the men had spoken in that chamber, it had grown stronger. Elliot leaned back, sweat cold on his skin. His uncle's note suddenly made perfect sense. Numbers lie. Names don't. If it's not shut, don't go in. David hadn't been leaving instructions to access the hatch. He had been leaving a warning. Never open it, never engage, never feed it with your name. But it was too late for Elliot. He had already answered, if not with his voice, then with his search. He had brought attention back to Darlow, dragged the silence into the light. And in doing so, he had given it what it wanted most. Remembrance. That night, as he tried to rest, he woke to a sound in the motel room. Not the air conditioner, not the traffic outside. A whisper curling just above his ear. "Elliot." Elliot sat upright in the motel bed, pulse hammering. The room was dark except for the thin stripe of neon bleeding through the blinds. He knew he hadn't imagined it. The whisper had said his name. Not just a sound carried from memory, but personal, direct. "Elliot." He turned the tape recorder off, convinced it must have bled audio from the cassette. But the device wasn't even on. The whisper hadn't come from the machine. It had come from the air. In the silence that followed, Elliot realized he had crossed a threshold. This was no longer just investigation. The case wasn't a cold file. It was alive, feeding, adapting. It had found him the way it had found his uncle 40 years earlier. The next day he drove back to Osceola, desperate for guidance from Deputy Mercer. He laid everything on the table. The cassette, the notebooks, the photographs, the whisper he had heard in the night. Mercer listened in silence, jaw set, eyes locked on the evidence like it was poison. Then he slid a photograph from his own drawer across the table. The image was black and white, grainy, clearly old. It showed the foundation pit during the Gulf Station's construction in 1970. Men in hard hats stood ankle-deep in rebar and dirt. And at the bottom of the pit, barely visible, was a square hatch already set into the earth. Long before any slab had been poured, long before 3 men vanished, the hatch had been there, waiting. "I tried to bring this to the captain," Mercer muttered. "He told me it was a trick of the light, told me I needed a break. But I know what I saw. That hatch wasn't built by us. It was there first." The implication chilled Elliot. The Gulf Station wasn't the mistake. It was the disguise. Someone had chosen to build right over the opening, using commerce and routine to cover a structure no one wanted to admit existed. That night, Elliot sat in his motel surrounded by evidence, recorder in hand. He asked himself 3 questions out loud. What happens if I release this? What happens if I don't? And what would David have done? He knew there was no right answer. If he exposed it, he would unleash panic and maybe worse. If he stayed silent, he would join the long line of people who had chosen denial over truth. Either way, the whisper had already attached itself. The only difference now was whether it would spread. 2 weeks later, he recorded one final entry. His voice was steady, but the weight beneath it was unmistakable. October 18, 2021. I've gone as far as I can. The tape is real. The chambers are real. Whatever they found down there, it's still sealed. I don't know if it's alive. I don't know if it was ever human. But it remembered David's name. And now it remembers mine. If you're hearing this, don't go looking. Don't dig it up. Don't try to prove me right, because some truths aren't lost. They're waiting. He clicked the recorder off. For a moment, only silence. Then, so faint it might have been imagined, the whisper returned. Did you come back for me? The whisper clung to Elliot like a shadow. Even after leaving Darlow, even after crossing state lines, he carried it with him. Each new motel felt emptier than the last, but none were silent. In the hum of fluorescent lights, in the drone of passing trucks, in the stillness of midnight, it surfaced, faint, persistent. Elliot, did you come back for me? He mailed off the last of his evidence before he disappeared from Missouri. Copies of the photographs, transcripts of the tape, Mercer's notes, even the survey maps marked "Do Not Dig." One sent to a journalist friend in Chicago, sealed with a note that read, "If you don't hear from me in 30 days, release everything." Another to Mercer, who seemed resigned to bear the weight of truth no one else wanted. Elliot kept one set for himself, though he wasn't sure why. Driving south along empty highways, he thought about David, about the lighter with the Show Me State logo, about the tally marks scratched into stone, about the initials DR carved into the steel wall of that chamber. His uncle hadn't just vanished. He had fought to leave a trace, a voice, a warning. And now Elliot had picked up where he left off. But the deeper truth was harder to face. This wasn't just an unsolved disappearance. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a decision, made by men in authority, enforced by silence, repeated across decades. To bury, to burn, to seal. Because what lay beneath Darlow wasn't meant to be uncovered. Still, Elliot couldn't let it go. At night, he replayed the tape again and again, as though searching for something hidden inside the hiss. And every time the voice came, soft, mechanical, but almost human. It sounded less like a monster and more like a child left behind. "Did you come back for me?" The plea wasn't threatening. It was lonely, and that made it worse. Because loneliness waits. Loneliness clings. Loneliness learns. Weeks later, a roadside motel camera captured Elliot walking into his room but never recorded him leaving. His belongings were still there the next morning. His recorder, his notepad, the box of evidence. The last entry on the tape ended mid-sentence, his voice cutting out into silence. Then, faint and distorted, a whisper bled through the static. Not just asking this time, answering. "Yes, you came back." The official files still list David Rohr, Tommy Geller, and Mark Dunley as missing persons. No remains have ever been found. The Gulf Station was demolished, its lot fenced and marked unsafe, though no public explanation was given. The town of Darlow continues its quiet life, avoiding the subject the way it has for 4 decades. But in the attics of old houses, in the boxes families can't quite throw away, fragments still surface. Photographs, notes, forgotten tapes, pieces of a story that refuses to die. And if you listen closely enough, not to the police reports, not to the rumors, but to the silence itself, sometimes you can still hear it. Not everything buried stays dead. Some things wait, some things remember, and some things are still whispering, just beneath the surface. 40 years ago, 3 young men vanished from a gas station on the edge of Darlow, Missouri. Official reports called it voluntary disappearance. Families called it impossible. The town called it silence. But beneath the concrete slab where the Gulf Station once stood, another story was written, in tally marks carved into stone, in initials scratched into steel, in a voice preserved on tape. Elliott's investigation unearthed fragments long buried. A chamber built before the station itself, sealed and resealed by men who chose quiet over truth. Witnesses dismissed, files burned, reinforced concrete poured over unanswered questions. Every generation that stumbled too close learned the same lesson. There are places you don't open, voices you don't answer. And yet, the whisper persists. A plea recorded in 1981, repeated again in 2021. Not a monster scream, not a human cry, but something in between. Did you come back for me? The phrase is less a threat than an invitation, soft enough to slip past reason, intimate enough to sink deep into memory. It lingers because it feels unfinished, because it feels like it's waiting. For the families, closure never came. For the town, the story faded into rumor. For Elliott, the search became the silence that consumed him. His final recordings remain locked in evidence, too chilling to release, too dangerous to ignore. And in the static of those tapes, investigators swear they hear something more. Not just a question, but an answer. Yes, you came back. Which leaves only one truth behind all the theories, behind all the erasures. Some things are not meant to be explained, only endured. Some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved, but cages meant to remain sealed. And when the ground hums, when the silence breathes, when the whisper calls your name, you remember what Darlow has known all along. Not everything stays buried. Some things wait.